When we first fall in love with a piece of music, one which we've come to cherish, it is such a subjective experience. We almost come to feel like we co-wrote the music. It becomes that ingrained in our experiences and memory that describing why you like it can often sound more like a memoir than a discussion of merit. I'm guilty of this for sure, but it's something that we can't escape from entirely. However, art's importance and longevity ultimately rest outside of the subjective, in how it can relate emotion and experiences across time and space. The more specific, niche associations we each hold for a piece of music are just icing on the cake. These were the things I considered when the idea of doing this list came to me. In honesty, it was inspired by Pat Chennington's own Top 10 Albums video. I wanted to avoid a pitfall we might all succumb to when telling people about why we love a piece, and that is getting too personal with it. It's fun for us, but if not balanced by an appraisal of how the music itself affects you, it ends up feeling like someone is telling you about an okay dream they had. I wanted to make this video fun, so I hope you think so as well. I split up the list into 3 categories: traditional albums, could be anything from pop to folk, film scores, and classical. Now, let's get down to it. Enjoy. The Monkees are my favorite band. I've loved them since I was introduced to them as a kid back in the summer of 2000, listening to a best of cassette on trips to the public pool or while trading Pokemon cards with my neighborhood friends. The Monkees' music really hums with the energy of summer. Their album, More of the Monkees, has some of their best known hits, but also captures the essential warm frivolity their songs were known for, even though this was before they began writing or playing their own music. Songs like Antique Griselda are bizarre and darkly humorous. I'm Not Your Stepping Stone sounds like some proto-punk with the banging percussion and Mickey's angry vocals. Even a weird, saccharine track like The Day We Fall in Love has some great arrangement to it, and I find it funny to imagine some tween girl in the 60s lying on her bed swooning at the thought of Davy Jones saying these sweet nothings to her personally. Back in the summer of 2013, I commuted to an internship in Philly, back and forth on the Patco rail. On many of those trips, I listened to this album by David Bowie, watching the dim subway stations fly past as if in reaction to the restless energy of the album. Scary Monsters and Super Creeps took a while to grow on me, but eventually I found myself listening to it more and more. On the surface, the album has an abrasive, coarse texture, though after a second listen, that harsh tone almost becomes like a hot bath that you ease into. The opening It's No Game Part 1, with the Japanese woman speaking while Bowie screams, just conjures all kinds of energetic imagery. The title track got under my skin, as it seemed to be about an ill-advised romance, along with the music underneath, which sounds like a barking dog constantly chasing after you. Teenage Wildlife is great and pulls you along into this youthful hysteria, accompanied by those wonderful backing vocals. The album's a great plunge to make each time, just like when I was hurtling through those dark subway tunnels. Scott Walker is one of my favorite musical discoveries of the last few years, but unfortunately it was right after he passed away in 2019. Nevertheless, I can't recommend his music more highly, and it's hard to really pick one album to call a favorite, but this one has become closer to that over time. Scott Walker's third solo album is a melancholy and oh-so-gorgeous visit to a cold and wintry landscape. Most of its songs are in 3/4 time, so there's a sort of merging of songs in one's mind if you're not paying attention. The eerie strings that open the first track, It's Raining Today, are a brilliant foundation for the lyrics and represent the kind of the arrangers Scott had with him on his albums. Rosemary is a sad story about a woman still living with her mother and not sure if she'll ever get out. With such large and sweeping string sections, the words of the songs take on almost cosmic importance, larger than life for sure. When I worked at one of several warehouses, a near-empty one, I sometimes would play this album off my phone and let it echo from the rafters up above while I pressed on with one tedium after another. You'll soon be mesmerized by it once you listen to it too. I think I'm one of many people whose introduction to Leonard Cohen was not Hallelujah, but the film McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I'd been rightly fascinated by Winter Lady, but it wasn't until years after a friend gave me the album that I listened to the whole thing. The lyrics in his songs carry you through into a parallel world, with surrealism and magic realism. Yet it's the soothing quality of these songs which makes the whole album like a warm cup of tea, made from the leaves of an unknown plant. Master Song is downright stunning, the images thrown into my head like a projector. At yet another warehouse job, I sat in the noisy clamor with a small Bluetooth speaker, playing this album. Somehow everything else melted away, and I was put into another life, experiencing love and loss, all as I assembled indefinable machines. One thing I love about these songs is that they have some really nice arrangements aside from the guitar, which is the focus of each song. They open up the vista of the worlds Cohen sings into something greater, more colorful, and haunting. One of my great discoveries from YouTube itself, a place where I've discovered a ton of music I now call favorites. Dreams by Gabor Shabo was just another recommended video with appealing artwork. From the first second, I was arrested by the trembling guitar and that hazy reverb. This album is like incense in musical form. I'm not even sure what to call this genre, psychedelic classical guitar. No matter, it's marvelous. Most of the times I've played it have been while I'm working on a painting. Appropriately, there's something about the music that is archaic and mysterious and feels connected to the unconscious. The occasional entries of a violin and even horns at one point add opulence to match the lovely cover art by John Austin. Take a nap while listening to this Orientalist trip and you'll probably have some wild dreams of your own. Since I love the Monkees, it stands to reason I'd follow my favorite of the band as he charts his own course. Michael Nezmuth started his post-Monkees musical career with the First National Band and a trio of albums which, if you enjoy old country rock, feel like a full-course meal. Not only is Nezmuth a genius songwriter, but these songs transcend the genre with a lot of dreamy acoustics and effects, yet they never fall into psychedelia. Magnetic South, the first of these three, Red, White, and Blue albums, has some great tracks. A couple songs are reworked from versions Nezmuth did while with the Monkees, given a different flavor here. Many of the songs conjure images of sunny days, green grass, blue skies, and white monuments. Joanne is a beautiful and haunting song that instills the feeling of a long-lost love, while also having a colorful, hopeful air. The final track, Beyond the Blue Horizon, utilizes sound effects to suggest the progression of a day from morning to night, with the goings-on that occur on a quiet farm. I always imagine some of these songs being sung by a decked-out Michael Nezmuth in some cavernous bandstand painted in gaudy blue with stars and stripes, the smell of fried food ever present. With any song from this album, I can feel myself driving around South Jersey in the heat of summer, headed to a friend's house. The Seeds of Love perfectly captures the kind of late 80s, early 90s sound I was born into. Vestiges of it can be found in various music I grew up with, like Billy Joel's River of Dreams. Every song on this album is a lush production, layered with so many great sounds like the colors in a Van Gogh. Each song carries with it a lot of emotion, phrases that feel like things told to you as a kid. Sowing the Seeds of Love is an incredible feast for the ears. Standing on the corner of the third world feels like a journey into a dark, sweltering night. And Swords and Knives has the kind of lonely quality in its opening that would have been adopted by Vaporwave eventually. There isn't a song under 4 minutes, and you'll feel like you've just soaked up an entertaining and edifying experience. Technically, this is a compilation, but it qualifies as an album and it's a treasured part of my pop collection. One thing that my favorite songs do is capture me with a strong story and emotion. Fittingly, the first time I heard the Shangri-Las was on a jukebox in a diner somewhere. I didn't like it at the time. Cut to many years later, and my friend puts on a 45 of Leader of the Pack, and I'm captivated by the utter theatricality and melodrama of it. Their songs are tragic, strange, and just plain operatic. Some of their songs aren't even really sung. I Can Never Go Home Anymore is devastatingly sad, and you're just strung along for the ride by the music. Past, Present, and Future is a chillingly beautiful song about a past trauma. In each song, the drama of the lyrics and dialogue create a theater of the imagination that burns some pretty unforgettable imagery into your mind. And yes, I'm aware of the recent meme using Remember, and now a new generation will discover the Shangri-Las. It's been hard to ignore Vaporwave over the past decade, even for someone who shuns contemporary music as much as me. But Vaporwave is so much about the past that it was probably inevitable I'd get into it. As with many albums in the genre, it isn't really about musicianship, but how well curated and presented the samples are, and how they flow to create an experience and atmosphere of nostalgia and longing. For me, these albums are best experienced when not completely paying attention, or when it interacts with our brain on a subconscious level. This is how the album Regret by Death's Dynamic Shroud connected with me. On yet another warehouse job, I listened to it while navigating the many narrowly spaced, tall shelves of restaurant supplies. The gloom between the shelves, coupled with the relaxing samples, transformed the warehouse into a forest or some kind of forgotten library. The overall theme of the album is melancholy, perhaps brought on by the titular regret of something done or undone. Let me tell you, there's nothing that feels more right than wandering through a maze-like warehouse while hearing dreamy, slowed-down music. It sends one on a mental journey. The samples range from R&B to things vaguely reminiscent of children's TV shows or video games. The track False sounds like you've escaped to a secret grove in the woods and is like a calm retreat from the uncertainty and malaise of the past hour. The album is also punctuated by the tear-jerking clip of NBA player Kevin Durant giving his "You the Real MVP" speech. In a moment like that, the album is encouraging us to focus on what good memories we have with us. And Regret does end on a positive note, telling the listener to wake up and get out of the darkness they might find themselves in. While it's not a great musical composition, the elements are placed in a way to create something that I think is valuable and bears returning to many times. This is one of the bands that my mom introduced me to in my early teens. Immediately I could hear the slick sound of affluent living crossed with youthful heat. Many of the songs feel like they're about people meandering through experiences with more money than they know what to do with. Songs that allow us to vicariously become one of the aimless jet set. A line from My Own Way states, "I saw you at the air race yesterday." That alone suggests intrigue and excitement, but also distance from our own normal lives, as if in a movie. Rio, the album, has the burning of an 80s summer or the chill of winter in its synths and vocals. There's something hauntingly cool about The Chauffeur, a song that inspires images of tall, black-haired women standing in front of a fighter jet at sunset. It's got an atmosphere of obsessional luxury. No wonder that the album art is by the great Patrick Nagel. It doesn't get much more authentically 80s than this. One of my first favorite movies was Journey to the Center of the Earth. I believe that was in large part due to this score. It's not only a character in itself, but it also suggests things beyond the frame, as if everything around the characters is alive and watching. This score is beautiful and grotesque, like a cathedral at night. When Herman said that the film had no emotion, only terror, I believe he meant his score. Underground, we hear slowly descending instruments, woodwinds that almost seem to growl. The many harps and the vibraphone emphasize the beauty of the unknown. The cue Lost somehow perfectly combines wonder and fear, as does Atlantis, some of the most mysterious music Herman ever wrote. In short, it's sublime, and it is atmospheric writing at its finest. Jerry Goldsmith has become one of my all-time favorite composers for his sheer versatility and imagination. His score for Star Trek The Motion Picture is vast and cosmic. It also has a great nautical romanticism to it. The sounds of the synths that Goldsmith integrates, as well as the mighty blaster beam, create a unique texture throughout the score. The enormity of the V'ger ship can practically be felt through the cavernous sonorities in the recording. I'd always be listening to this while perusing the Turan Trade Authority books I love so much. I would call this my warm blanket score. The Time Machine is in the pantheon of movies that had an indelible impact on my childhood. The music by Russell Garcia is prismatic in the emotional ground it covers. There is so much heart and warmth to it, inspired by the friendship between the characters George and David. It really resonates within just the score itself. That's what makes this film so dear to me, besides the wonder that I felt and still do feel when watching it. Other cues like Trapped in the Future are quite chilling. For the series of cues for when George travels into the realm of the Morlocks, we are treated to some great monster music, brooding and finally ferocious. Not to mention all the wild sound effects that Russell Garcia came up with to augment the atmosphere or time travel, or the ambience of the year 802,701 AD. It's just an overall great listening experience. Best listened to on a cold winter night near Christmas and New Year's. I'm sure a lot of you get warm feelings when hearing this score. I have a very specific memory of watching Hook in the family room of my house when I was 5 or 6 in the 90s. I'd built a fort using pillows and chairs and laid in the entrance watching Hook. The music has done just what I think John Williams intended, to instill in us the wonder and innocence of childhood. Now, many of his scores can claim that merit, but Hook is special for its glowing beauty and gorgeously written music. It's truly an underappreciated masterpiece and my favorite John Williams score. A long cue like Remembering Childhood is an emotional roller coaster and showcases some wonderful orchestration throughout. That shining warmth of the score makes us imagine a childhood slightly rosier than what really was, or perhaps it inspires us to hope for a life beyond this life. Aside from the philosophical, I just absolutely adore this music, and it never fails to transport me to a place of mirth. Happy thoughts indeed. I love mystery, and Zdeněk Liška's score for Jiraj Hertz's The Cremator comes from a dimension saturated in mystery. Liška is a master of the eerie chorus, and he uses voices in his score to unforgettable effect. You'd think the music had been written and performed in some dark, musty auditorium where the tapes then remained, also gathering dust. Then somehow to sing out from the darkness to whoever could receive their signals. It's not so easy to describe the feelings given by this music, and that's fine. One has to experience it for oneself, honestly, but it is some of the most haunting music you will ever hear. Although it was written to accompany the madness of a crematorium director, it could just as easily pair with the deep sea or the surface of the moon. Similar to Hook, this score is lush and grand, but has a darker side. I was one of those terrified by a certain scene when I was a kid. It wasn't until I was in college that I discovered how amazing the score was. David Shire isn't a well-known name, but this score is maybe the one he should be remembered for. I love it when a film composer embraces the design philosophy of a movie. Here, Shire recognizes the turn-of-the-century time period and the Art Nouveau production design. He complements that with highly romantic orchestrations and elegant strings. Yet that light touch of synths puts it in a realm of 80s fantasy. Also congruent with the time period, the score features some ragtime elements, which are delightful in their full version. When Oz is restored, we are treated to a gorgeous cue full of relief, but also longing. We find this again in the amazingly good end title music. It's certainly up there with Jerry Goldsmith's legend as one of the best fantasy scores of all time. Just when I was reaching adolescence, something clicked in me, and I suddenly became interested in World War II. Back in the small period of time just before and a little after 9/11 was a time I like to call the Golden Millennium. There was a drive to rediscover the parts of American history that made the country great. That involved looking back on the acts of those who fought in World War II. Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan began this, I think, and the game Medal of Honor was a result of that. My boyhood can be summed up in the cover artwork, showing a golden clouded sky behind the main hero, Jimmy Patterson, who stands ready to take on whatever the Nazis will throw at him. It was the music of this game which really connected it to not just war movies, but the Indiana Jones films, with its John Williams-esque orchestrations. I still maintain this is some of the finest music ever written for a video game. The compositions, the use of leitmotifs, and very good arrangements make this a timeless classic. Michael Giacchino went on to much wider fame with his Pixar scores and those for the new Star Trek films, but I always hold this as my favorite work of his, and I don't think his tone or sincerity could be replicated. Not now, anyway. The only full movie score by the composer of the Doctor Who theme. The Omega Man begins wistfully from the main theme and holds that melancholy line throughout. Charlton Heston, after all, is the last man on Earth. What this score does really well is pull off compellingly traditional writing for orchestra alongside instruments that place it firmly within the 1970s. The arrangement of the brass, rhythm section, guitar, electric organs, and the quite eerie water chimes give the score a distinct flavor. Often these sounds play with a smooth bed of strings underneath. There's some creepiness in several of the scores for scenes where Neville is hunting or being hunted, but much of the music has great pathos in it. That's a part of what has made not only the music but the film so enduring for 50 years. It's grand when it needs to be, and can also reel it in for the close moments between characters. It's 70s gothic romanticism, if there ever was such a thing. I'm happy to see one of my favorite movies as a kid get reappraised in recent years. For me, it was a fixation for quite a long time, and in no small part due to John Barry's score. Barry, the author of the James Bond sound, went through a shift in style in the mid to late 70s, wherein his music became far more romantic, but I'd even say haunting. The Black Hole's score is cosmic and mysterious, but has moments that elicit the sensation of glimpsing someone else's long-lost memories, such as in the cue 6 Robots. There's a sadness present here as well, appropriate for a key element in the plot. Besides the spinning, repetitive main theme, there's a feeling of floating aimlessly in space, on an antiquated ship in dust-covered halls. Much of the sets, I might add, could equate to one of the few real examples of liminal spaces in a science fiction film. Into the Hole is the real showstopper, a wonderful sequence that begins in swirling uncertainty, descends into darkness, and then rises to a joyful finale. A strange but outstanding score for an underrated Disney film. Both this film and the score hold special significance for me. Films like this and The Ten Commandments were frequently played by my parents. As a Christian, I found that the music in these films sometimes captured faith better than the songs I'd sometimes hear in church, but that's perhaps a matter of taste. Nevertheless, Miklos Rozsa practically solidified that sound of the biblical epics of the 50s and 60s. The score for BenHur is an epic piece of music in the truest sense of the word. It feels classical and timeless, as well as sacred and transcendent. Often you can sense it coming through a shroud of mist, as if it's an echo from the past. A lot of the vocabulary of this score, such as the characterization of the Roman Empire, became standard afterwards. The music during the battle at sea ranks in among the most heart-pounding ever written for such scenes. After a glorious 2.5 hours of music, the finale is amazing, and if you don't have chills by then, you probably have no soul. Classical music was the first music I ever heard. This CD of Charles Dutoit conducting the Montreal Symphony Orchestra was my first favorite album. As much as I love film scores, classical music is always more special, ultimately because it's a blank slate for the imagination, and for me, music has always been fuel for the mind's eye. I'd listen to this CD over and over, subjecting the world around me to whatever visions the music suggested. The Planets is a pretty iconic suite, especially Mars, which can be heard in so many film scores. Venus is exquisite and soothing. Saturn takes you down in my imagination to the netherworld, as if through Dante. While Uranus is sweeping and dazzling, an ideal choice for getting into classical music in general. Arnold Schoenberg is not a composer I'm well versed in, mainly because I'm not a fan of the 12-tone row. However, Transfigured Knight is one of my desert island pieces. It's a tone poem based on a written poem by Richard Demel, about a man and woman walking through a moonlit forest. She tells him that she is pregnant by another man. What is the first man's reaction? How does the poem resolve? You'll have to listen yourself to find out. Originally written for a sextet, my preferred version is this one, arranged for the strings of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Herbert von Karajan. The melodrama of the piece hardly lets up, sounding like the score to a silent film. But when it does let up, it is as if the music is telling us of the love of the couple, recollections of their moments falling in love. Incomparable use of strings on a large scale, they sometimes only flutter, other times growl like an earthquake. Truly incredible stuff. The best musical incarnation of Herman Melville's great book. I found a way to get Bernard Herrmann on here twice. He really is my favorite composer. You know when someone's music is coming from a soul that is close to your own. That's what Herrmann's music has been for me. This cantata is like the sea itself, at moments calm, others turbulent and fulminating. The way the libretto is delivered can be strange and even off-putting at first, and it's certainly unique, but I find it suits the mood of the piece. You really get into the torment and hateful drive within Captain Ahab, and Herrmann excelled at portraying the psychology of characters. The Whalers' hymn could stand on its own as an awesome concert piece, a standout moment in the cantata. It rises to heavenly glory, and from there we only descend. This particular recording is the only one conducted by Herrmann himself. However, something went wrong during recording and the loudest parts are often blown out. Regardless of that, it's my preferred recording because of the sheer raw power of the performance that Herrmann brought out of the orchestra and singers, and the rough recording quality only adds to that. An utterly cathartic experience. Alexander Scriabin once attempted to write an orchestral work of such magnitude and scope that, in his mystic mind, he hoped it would invoke the end of the world and the beginning of another. Only the sketches of the prefatory act were completed, and Alexander Nemtin took on the mantle of taking those and completing the first section. What we have is a 3-hour-long, 3-part opus of cosmic proportions. Not only is there a large orchestra, there is a full wordless chorus, wordless soprano, and an organ. From beginning to end, it is near restless, as if you are being hurled through space itself to the end of time. There are some movements where you feel like you are floating among the flotsam at the beginning of creation. There is catastrophe, horror, beauty, and transformation. Remember, this was only an approximation of the prefatory act, not the mysterium itself. But prepare yourself. It is as if you're setting out on a wild journey, and you may not return unchanged. On the far more classical side of things, we have one of my favorite symphonies of all time, in an excellent recording conducted by the great Wilhelm Furtwängler. I'll get to him more later. Brahms is a composer I slowly discovered that I love. From his incredible German Requiem to his 4 symphonies, Brahms waited a long time to write his first symphony, but it's truly the work of a genius. Engaging from the first moment, the symphony is full of wonderful ideas and melodies, as are the rest of his symphonies. His first, I think, is all about hope out of despair, which is the impression I get when listening to it. The first movement begins with a desperate cry to heaven almost, and we move through the subsequent movements to find noble feelings and deep compassion. In the final movement, it sounds like all may be lost, and then, like a distant call, comes the hope motif, as I like to call it. It grows, and later we're finally delivered into victory. If one needs to be uplifted emotionally, I can hardly think of a better work to do it. However, sometimes we're not always in the mood for bright things. Other times we feel the need to move about in the gloom, contemplating the wasteland. This symphony by Moise Weinberg, written in memory of Shostakovich, plunges you into a cloudy world of monoliths and mud. It's a trek across an empty landscape. We are confronted by awful sights, and at one point what can only be described as a jump scare. I discovered this work thanks to a channel called Velish Opus, wherein they brilliantly paired it with a painting by the amazing Beksinski. The acoustics in this recording really help to emphasize the sense of space and reinforce a feeling of being lost in a dark world. You really soak up the mood, and there's something therapeutic in all this gloom. However, it does contain a moment of soft beauty and happiness in the last movement, tucked in among the eerie scenery. If you were to save one recording of Beethoven's Ninth for posterity because of its cultural significance, this would be it. Not for the quality of the fidelity, but for the power of the performance and the context in which it was made. Wilhelm Furtwängler was the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic when the Nazis came into power. He stayed in Germany in the hopes of merely remaining an artist, without getting into any political entanglements. This was not easy, especially for someone like Furtwängler, who once, when Hitler not so idly threatened to send him to a concentration camp, said to the dictator's face, "At least then I'd be in good company." This recording, made in 1942 for Hitler's birthday concert, is the most passionate ninth. Furtwängler channeled his rage and anger at his predicament and the predicament of Germany itself into this performance. All throughout, it foments with explosiveness, but when the finale of the last movement is reached, then everything is let loose, practically to head-banging intensity. It's the most ferocious recording of Beethoven's great symphony ever, and a testament to an incredible man. The first film I ever saw was Fantasia, and that defined cinema for me from then on. My favorite segment was Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. I had no idea of the piece's scandalous premiere, and only liked it for the great drama of the dinosaurs and the strangeness of the music that seemed oddly compelling. Even on its own, I find it conjures images of an alien world. Years later, I discovered the full recording of the ballet, and eventually bought more recordings of it than any other work. My favorite has to be that conducted by Leonard Bernstein and the London Symphony Orchestra. I first heard this version in an excellent documentary on Max Ernst by Peter Chamonix. This recording of the Rite is epic in scope and savage in its bite. One gets swept up at the acoustics and dynamite orchestration. Games of the Rival Tribes sounds like a fight to the death in an arena, or a scene from a Frazetta painting. And The Chosen Victim is a showdown of the most titanic proportions. Opera is a hard sell for most, not least because a good recording can cost a pretty penny. The only Wagner opera I spent hard-earned money on was Parsifal, and it's been a worthy investment. Parsifal is an unusual opera. It's almost like a mystical liturgy. It's often criticized for its slowness, and for a time I had wondered if I'd made the right decision in throwing down $60 for it. Years of listening to it in the background and then realizing I needed to hear it again have solidified it as a treasured favorite. Parsifal is otherworldly and grand. However, that impression is because of the recording I bought, Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic. The sonics are just about perfect. It sounds as if you're listening to it from in a colossal stone church, hidden away from time. Taken in whole, Parsifal, a story about a sect of knights kept alive untold centuries by the Holy Grail, is ultimately one of redemption. Not less than a few times have I listened to this opera in its entirety while working one of my warehouse jobs, my soul reinforced and my heart thankful that God has allowed such music to exist. Kurt Atterberg is not well known at all. However, he's my favorite musical discovery of the last year. Atterberg hides in the plethora of late Romantic composers. He is Swiss, and so his music is a sort of alternate version of what the rest of Europe would have sounded like if World War I had never happened. Theoretically, anyhow. His music is the perfection and continuation of the Romantic movement. Besides that, Atterberg is a phenomenal orchestrator and inventor of melodies. Almost unbelievably good. I couldn't put it any better than this Amazon reviewer did. The music always goes right where you want it to go, perfectly, yet without you knowing it's going there. I can't recommend his symphonies enough. They're evergreen in the returns they grant on each listen. Sweetness to the ears and heartiness for the soul. The two symphonies on this disc are great together, and I could gush about each movement, but I'll just say that the second movements from 7 and 8 are maybe the most gorgeous sounds you'll ever hear from an orchestra. The Semplice from Symphony 7 is like a long-lost summer night spent under the moon with a sweetheart, brief and fleeting now. The Adagio from Symphony 8 starts with a tender and moving passage for solo trumpet, then flute, something small and loved taking flight. The movement then turns into a rapturous love letter to the countryside. I can see leaves flitting and the sun setting. It's all there. Well, that's it. And I didn't expect making this would be so cathartic, but I really have enjoyed sharing these appreciations and recollections with you all. I hope you end up checking out at least some of these albums and pieces. Maybe they'll brighten and spice up your life like they did mine.